In a small neighborhood where businesses were forced to pay for their own survival, Royal Roots stood defiant, a place of warmth, resilience, and community. J-Rock and his crew saw none of that when they walked through its doors. They saw a fat black woman, apron tied around her waist, her hands dusted with the remnants of another workday. To them, she was soft, predictable, just another shop owner who would fold under pressure. They had done it before. Threats, violence, broken glass, if necessary. Everyone had a breaking point. But Amira Williams wasn't like everyone else. Before she ever picked up a pair of shears, she had carried weapons far deadlier, trained in the art of war, survived battles that had left men like J-Rock in the dirt. She had spent years honing her instincts, sharpening her body into something built for combat, built to endure. The gang thought they were forcing a woman into submission. Instead, they were cornering a soldier, daring her to fight back. And when the dust settled, when fists had flown and blood had been spilled, it wouldn't be Royal Roots that lay in ruins. It would be them. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe. The steady hum of clippers, the rhythmic snip of scissors, and the warm scent of coconut oil filled Royal Roots' salon. The afternoon sun streamed through the large front window, casting golden light on the polished floors. Amira Williams stood behind her chair, effortlessly twisting a client's thick curls into neat coils. Her hands worked with skill and purpose, but her eyes flicked toward the front of the shop, always watching, always aware. She saw him first. A young gang member, no older than 20, leaned against the lamppost across the street, pretending to scroll through his phone. He wasn't fooling anyone. The same kid had been there the past 3 days, staring through the glass, taking mental notes, testing the waters. Amira exhaled slowly, tightening a coil with practiced ease. "Ms. Amira, you hear what happened to Sonny's Deli?" Nia, one of her stylists, asked, lowering her voice. Amira didn't look up. "What happened?" "They smashed his windows in last night, tagging his walls, talking about how he needs to pay his dues." A knowing silence fell over the salon. Another business hit. Another warning. Amira nodded, finishing the last twist. She met her client's eyes in the mirror, giving her a reassuring smile. "You're all set, baby. You know the drill. Oil those roots. Wrap it at night." The client smiled back, but the weight of the conversation lingered. The door chime jingled. The shop went still. Jared J-Rock Simmons walked in like he owned the place, flanked by 2 of his men. He was tall, broad, and carried himself with the arrogance of a man who had never been told no. His presence was suffocating, filling the salon with unspoken threats. He clapped his hands together, flashing a wolfish grin. "Damn, this place is nice. Real nice." Amira didn't stop moving. She turned toward the counter, wiping her hands on a towel, unfazed. "You lost? J-Rock?" A chuckle rippled through his crew. "Nah, I know exactly where I'm at." His grin widened, but his eyes were sharp. "Came to talk business." A tense silence filled the room. Amira leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "Then, talk." J-Rock let the silence stretch, savoring the way the tension in the room thickened, the air itself turning dense with the weight of his presence. He moved slowly, deliberately, his dark eyes dragging over every inch of the salon, lingering just long enough on each detail to make it clear that he wasn't just looking, he was claiming the space. His fingers tapped lazily against the edge of the counter as he turned back to Amira, his gold-toothed grin widening. "You been running this little spot for what, 5, 10 years?" He clicked his tongue, shaking his head as if it truly was a shame. "Damn shame if it all went to waste." Amira, unmoved, continued wiping her hands on the towel, her expression as solid and steady as ever. "You wasting my time? Or you getting to the point?" J-Rock's smirk faltered, just slightly. A quick flicker, like a candle caught in a sudden draft. His boys caught it. The subtle hesitation, the momentary loss of control. But J-Rock was quick, rolling his shoulders and masking the slip with a slow shake of his head. "Damn, Amira. That's cold." His voice carried a mocking warmth, like he was disappointed but still amused by her defiance. "I'm out here, trying to help a sister out, And you acting like I'm the bad guy." One of his boys, Dre, let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "That's the thing, boss. Women like her don't ever know when they need help." J-Rock's grin stretched wider, his gaze sweeping over Amira, slow and deliberate, like he was assessing her, like she was less a business owner and more a thing to be judged. "You sittin' real comfortable behind this counter, huh?" His voice dropped slightly, an undercurrent of something uglier slipping through. "Bet you been sittin' real comfortable your whole damn life." Reese, the other man standing just behind him, snorted, shaking his head. "Yeah, she looked like she been eatin' good, putting all that money into biscuits instead of security." The laughter from his boys hit like a slap, rippling through the shop, bouncing off the walls. Nia stiffened where she stood, her jaw tightening as her grip tightened around the spray bottle she was holding. Marcus exhaled through his nose, rolling his shoulders like he was forcing himself to stay still. But Amira? Amira was motionless. She didn't flinch, didn't shift, didn't even blink. J-Rock watched her carefully, as if waiting for something, waiting for her to break. But when she didn't fold under his stare, his grin curled into something meaner. "See, I know you're smart," he continued, stepping even closer, crowding her space. "You ain't dumb enough to think you can fight off the whole world." His voice lowered, the false friendliness melting away, leaving only the raw threat beneath. "This neighborhood, it's changin'. More desperate people moving in. You never know who might walk in here one night. Maybe someone mad. Maybe someone careless." His gaze flickered toward the cash register. "Maybe someone just looking to take what they think they deserve." The weight of his words pressed against the room. Amira remained still, her voice steady and smooth when she finally spoke. "You sellin' protection?" J-Rock's lips parted into a slow grin, his teeth flashing gold. "Nah, I'm offering protection. That's the difference. This ain't some shakedown, Queen. This is community service. We just making sure everything stays peaceful." The amusement returned to his voice, but there was something meaner underneath it now. He tilted his head, eyes dancing over her frame once again, deliberately slow, deliberately insulting. "I mean, look at you," he murmured, clicking his tongue. "Built like a damn tank, but still fragile in all the ways that matter." He let out a slow whistle, shaking his head like it was truly a shame. "You ever think about what happens if, let's say, you trip one day? One bad fall, and all that weight come crashing down?" The laughter from his boys was even louder this time, bouncing off the walls, filling the salon like smoke. Nia shifted on her feet, lips pressed into a thin line, her shoulders stiff. Marcus inhaled slowly, gripping the clippers in his hand like he was considering using them for something else. J-Rock grinned, feeding off the reaction. Then, without another word, he reached over the counter and popped open the register. The click of the drawer sliding open sounded like a gunshot in the silence. Before anyone could react, he grabbed a handful of cash. A 20, a 5, a couple of ones. Not much. But that wasn't the point. The point was that he did it right in front of her. A direct challenge. The sound of rustling bills ripped through the tension. J-Rock flipped through the money lazily, rubbing the 20 between his fingers like he was testing the quality. "Damn, feels real soft," he muttered. "Guess that's what happens when you don't gotta work hard for it, huh?" Then, with a casual flick of his wrist, he tossed the money onto the floor. It fluttered down between them, landing in a crumpled mess at Amira's feet. "Oops," he murmured. Then, before anyone could stop him, he reached behind him, grabbed one of the glass shampoo bottles off the shelf, and let it slip from his fingers, shatter. The bottle exploded against the hardwood floor, liquid splattering across the surface, the scent of honey and coconut oil instantly thick in the air. The salon gasped. Dre let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "Damn. Clumsy as hell, boss." J-Rock turned back to Amira, watching her, waiting for her to fold, waiting for fear to settle in, waiting for her to be like the others. Amira finally moved, her thick fingers clamped around his wrist, tight, fast, like a damn vice. J-Rock froze. The laughing stopped. His boys stiffened, their cocky postures flickering with uncertainty. Amira didn't say a word. She just squeezed. J-Rock's fingers twitched. His wrist flexed against her grip, but she didn't budge. His face twitched. Not from pain, but from realization. Realization that he had just miscalculated. He yanked his arm back. Too hard, too quick, like he was escaping instead of taking control. His smirk was gone. He shoved the money back into the register, slamming the drawer shut, his jaw tight. His eyes flickered over her once more, but he didn't step closer this time. Instead, he inhaled sharply through his nose, rolling his shoulders back like he was brushing off the moment. "Aight," he said, voice a little too even. "I get it." He turned, flicking his fingers toward the door, motioning for his boys to follow. At the door, J-Rock paused, just for a second. "Next time?" His voice was calm, but there was an edge now, something darker curling beneath the surface. "I won't be so friendly." And then he was gone. The scent of broken shampoo still lingered in the air, long after J-Rock and his crew walked out of Royal Roots. The shards of glass glittered under the fluorescent lights, a few larger pieces embedded in the grooves of the wooden floor. The shop had fallen into a thick silence, like the walls themselves were holding its breath. Nia was the first to move. With quick, jerky motions, she grabbed the broom from the back corner and started sweeping up the mess, her hands tight on the handle, muttering curses under her breath. Marcus bent down to help, shaking his head as he picked up the larger shards of glass with careful fingers. Amira remained where she stood behind the counter, arms crossed over her broad chest, her face unreadable. "Amira?" Nia's voice sliced through the silence, her tone sharp with anger barely held in check. "What the hell was that?" Amira didn't react. Nia threw down the broom, her patience snapping. "That was a test," she answered for her, her voice growing louder. "And what? We just ignore it? Pretend this ain't the same thing they did to Sonny's Deli before they busted out his windows? You think they're just gonna walk away?" She gestured toward the broken bottle, the spilled product seeping into the cracks of the floor. "They ain't just testing, Amira. They're warming up." Marcus ran a hand over his head, his jaw tight. "She's right," he said quietly. "We need to be real about this. You know what's coming next." Amira did know. J-Rock had already made up his mind. He had walked in here already decided that Royal Roots was his next claim. And this? This was the beginning. The next time, he wouldn't just be breaking things. The next time, he wouldn't just be making a statement. He would tear this place apart to prove a point. She should have been afraid. She wasn't. She had seen worse men than J-Rock in far worse places than this. "We keep running business as usual," she said finally, her voice level. Nia let out a sharp breath, hands going to her hips. "That's it? That's your whole plan?" Amira leaned forward against the counter, meeting her stare with an unshaken calm. "They want me scared. They want me to fold before they even have to do anything. So we keep moving. We keep working." Nia looked ready to argue, but she saw something in Amira's face that made her swallow whatever words were sitting on her tongue. She shook her head instead, grabbing the broom again and sweeping harder than necessary. Marcus, however, wasn't letting this go. "And what happens when they come back, Amira? 'Cause they will. You know how this goes. They're gonna start harassing the shop, making it impossible to do business until you give in." Amira's fingers tapped slowly against the countertop, because Marcus was right. The next morning, Royal Roots opened as usual. The neon sign flickered on, chairs were set up, stations were prepped. The scent of curling irons heating up mixed with the aroma of fresh coffee, and customers started filtering in, chatting and laughing, as if the tension from the day before hadn't soaked into the walls. But Amira knew better. It started small. At first, it was just presence. J-Rock's boys started hanging around outside, posted up on the curb across the street, leaning against parked cars, smoking and talking loudly. They weren't blocking the door, but they were watching. Always watching. Then, they started getting closer. Dre and Reese leaned against the wall right next to the entrance, their bodies relaxed, their smirks lazy. But the message was clear. Every time a customer walked in, they muttered something under their breath. Sometimes it was harmless. "Damn, sis, you look good today." Other times it was more pointed. "You sure you want to spend money here? Whole place might be gone next week." A few of the regulars started hesitating, glancing nervously at the men before stepping inside. By the third day, the gang upped the pressure. They started parking their bikes in front of the entrance, forcing customers to weave through them just to get inside. One of the younger gang members, some little punk barely out of high school, started playing his music loud as hell, the bass shaking the windows of the shop. Then the window broke, a brick, thrown in the dead of night, crashing through the glass. A picture frame shattered. A photo of Amira's mother, the woman who had inspired her to open Royal Roots in the first place. The message was clear. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about breaking her. Nia was furious when she arrived that morning. "Oh, hell no. This is war." Marcus stood next to her, arms crossed, his face unreadable. "What now, eh?" Amira bent down, picking up the picture frame from the floor, brushing the shards of glass off carefully. She didn't answer, not at first. Then, in the silence, a voice cut in. "I can file a report. But you know how this goes." Detective Kyle Burns stood in the doorway, arms crossed, looking at the damage with a look of forced sympathy. Amira exhaled through her nose. She had been expecting him. Burns was always around, the one officer that still gave this part of the neighborhood any attention. He was a man who looked exhausted, the kind of cop who had seen too much, lost too much, and stopped pretending he could fix it all. He stepped inside, glancing around. "I heard about J-Rock stopping by. And now this?" He motioned to the broken glass with a tilt of his head. "You know how these things go. You push back. They push harder." Amira's lips pressed into a thin line. "And what exactly are you suggesting, Detective?" Burns sighed, rubbing a hand over his tired face. "I'm saying you play it smart. You let it go. You don't poke the bear." His eyes met hers, steady. "They want you scared. They want you to react. Don't give them a reason to make it worse." Nia let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "Oh, right. So she's just supposed to let them take whatever they want?" Burns's expression was careful. "I'm saying, pick your battles." Amira studied him, her expression unreadable. She had a feeling Burns wasn't just giving advice. He was warning her. "I'll take care of it," she said finally. Burns studied her for a moment longer, then gave a small nod. "Let me know if you need anything." He turned, walking out, the door closing softly behind him. The moment he was gone, Nia shook her head. "That's it? That's your grand plan? Take care of it?" Amira set the broken frame on the counter, her fingers tightening around the edge. "We get ready," she murmured. Marcus frowned. "For what?" Amira lifted her head, her reflection fractured in the remaining shards of the broken window. "For when they come back." The night after the window was shattered, Amira sat alone in Royal Roots, the lights dim. The only sound the soft hum of the refrigerator in the break room. The broken glass had been swept, the picture frame tucked away. But the damage remained. It wasn't just about the money. It wasn't even about the shop. This was a challenge. J-Rock wasn't just trying to intimidate her. He was trying to own her, trying to force her to accept that Royal Roots would never truly be hers unless he allowed it. That was never going to happen. She rolled her shoulders, exhaled, and got to work. The first thing she did was reinforce the doors. The front door had a basic lock, but that wouldn't cut it. She went to the back room, rummaging through her supply shelves until she found what she needed. A metal security bar. She fixed it into place, testing its weight, nodding in satisfaction when it held steady. No more easy break-ins. Next, she turned her attention to the windows. The broken one was already boarded up, but that wouldn't stop them from coming back for more. She measured out thick wooden panels and secured them over every vulnerable window, sealing them tight. If they wanted to get inside, they'd have to work for it. She moved through the shop like a woman possessed, reinforcing what needed to be reinforced, removing anything that could be used against her. She wasn't just securing the shop. She was fortifying it. Once the physical barriers were in place, she turned her focus to weapons. She wasn't naive. She knew that when J-Rock came back, he wouldn't just come to break things. He'd bring his people. And this time, it wouldn't just be threats and bricks. She went to her office, unlocking the small metal case she hadn't touched in years. Inside, her old Army Ranger combat knife lay on the velvet lining, polished, sharp as ever. The weight of it in her hand was familiar. She slipped it into a sheath and secured it under the counter. Then, she reached under the register, pulling out a small baseball bat, not a cheap aluminum one. This was solid wood, weighty in her grip. She tested the swing, nodding to herself. If it came to it, she'd be ready. Blocking the doors wasn't enough. She needed to control the space. She pulled out a long roll of fishing wire from the back room and began stringing it across the main walkway, just a few inches above the ground. Not enough to be obvious, but enough to send a careless man tumbling forward. Near the shampoo station, she positioned a bucket of hot water, balanced on the edge of a shelf. A well-placed nudge, and it would fall, scalding and distracting anyone who thought they could rush her. At the back door, she scattered baby oil across the smooth floor, knowing that the second someone stormed in without thinking, they'd end up on their ass. None of it was deadly, but it would give her the upper hand. And that was all she needed. The next morning, when Nia walked in for her shift, she stopped mid-step, eyes scanning the boarded-up windows, the extra locks, the tripwires strung up near the floor. Her face twisted. The hell is all this? Marcus stepped in behind her, taking it all in, his brows raising as he eyed the baby oil gleaming on the back floor. Amira emerged from the back room, dusting her hands off on a rag. Preparation, she said simply. Nia blinked. Preparation for what? The Hunger Games? Marcus let out a low chuckle, rubbing his chin. Damn, you rigged this place like a damn battlefield. Amira shrugged. You think they're just gonna walk in and leave? J-Rock don't operate like that. When he comes back, he's coming for more than just a conversation. Nia stared at her, then at the bat leaning against the counter. You expecting a fight? I'm expecting them to push their luck. Amira met her gaze evenly. And I plan to be ready when they do. A silence settled between them. Then Marcus let out a slow breath and grinned. Hell, he said, shaking his head. Guess I better bring my work boots tomorrow. Amira smirked. Might be a good idea. Nia exhaled sharply, rubbing her temples. Y'all are insane, she muttered. But when she looked at Amira again, there was something else behind the frustration. Respect. Because Amira wasn't backing down. She was getting ready. And when the time came, J-Rock was going to realize just how badly he underestimated her. The tension had been building for days. Amira knew it was coming. J-Rock wasn't the type to let a challenge go unanswered. She had humiliated him the last time he stepped foot inside Royal Roots, and men like him didn't take humiliation lightly. That night, as she locked up the shop, she took one last look at her handiwork. The reinforced doors, the traps carefully placed, the makeshift weapons stashed in easy reach. She let her fingers brush over the bat resting within arm's reach beneath the counter, feeling the weight of it, solid and familiar, before letting her hand drop to her side. Everything was in place. All that was left was to wait, and she didn't have to wait long. The first sign of their arrival came in the form of a low, rolling growl of engines outside, the deep-throated rumble of motorcycles and the occasional rev of an impatient car. The sound was unmistakable, the kind of noise that sent a shiver of anticipation through the air, announcing their presence before they even stepped foot on the pavement. Amira, standing in the darkened shop, glanced toward the clock on the wall. 11:47 p.m. Too late for casual business? Too early for the streets to be empty. Moving carefully, she stepped toward the boarded-up window, keeping her body low and out of sight, as she peered through a small gap between the wooden planks. The street outside, bathed in the dim, flickering light of the old street lamps, cast long shadows that stretched across the pavement, stretching and twisting as if they, too, sensed the violence creeping into the night. J-Rock stood at the center of the sidewalk, his arms hanging loose at his sides, his posture deceptively casual. But Amira could see the tension in his stance, the way his shoulders were drawn back just slightly, the way his head tilted forward, eyes scanning the building in front of him. He wasn't just here to make noise, he was here to take control. Flanking him were at least 6 men, each one exuding the same dangerous confidence, their expressions ranging from eager anticipation to cold calculation. One of them, tall and wiry, absent-mindedly flipped a crowbar in his hand, passing it from palm to palm as if testing the weight, while another, built like a bulldozer, rested a wooden bat on his shoulder, tapping it idly against his palm as he stared at the front door. Amira let out a slow, measured breath, feeling her heartbeat settle into a steady, controlled rhythm. She could already feel the surge of adrenaline creeping into her veins, sharpening her focus, making her hyper-aware of every sound, every movement, every potential threat. This was a feeling she knew well, the same sensation she had felt countless times before, right before a fight. Outside, J-Rock let out a quiet chuckle, his breath fogging up the glass on the broken window as he reached out, running his fingers along the boarded-up section, knocking twice with his knuckles in a slow, taunting rhythm. "You in there, Queen?" His voice was smooth, almost friendly, but dripping with mockery, the kind of tone that carried the weight of a threat hidden beneath false politeness. "Come on now. Don't be rude. You knew I was coming." Amira didn't move, didn't answer. J-Rock smirked, turning slightly to glance over his shoulder at his men. "She real quiet, huh? Guess all that big talk dried up." Dre, standing off to the side with his arms crossed, let out a low snicker, shaking his head. "Bet she hidin' in the back. You know how they do. Act all tough till it's time to throw hands." J-Rock exhaled sharply, as if disappointed, then motioned lazily toward one of the men beside him. "Go ahead," he said, his tone almost bored. The man stepped forward without hesitation, gripping the crowbar tighter as he raised it, then swung it directly into the wooden boards covering the window. The impact rang out like a gunshot, the sharp crack of splintering wood reverberating through the street, making the silence that followed feel even heavier. Inside, Amira's grip tightened around the bat. Another smash followed, the force of the second hit splitting the wood, sending jagged splinters flying into the night air. J-Rock sighed, shaking his head in feigned disappointment as he pulled a cigarette from his pocket, lighting it with a flick of his lighter. "See? I tried to be nice," he murmured, exhaling a plume of smoke into the air. "Gave you a chance. Real good deal. But you wanted to be hard-headed. Now I gotta remind you who really runs this street." Another crash. The final blow shattered the wooden barrier completely, sending a cascade of debris to the sidewalk. One of J-Rock's men reached through the gap, unlocked the door from the inside, and pushed it open. Amira inhaled through her nose, slow and steady. They had just stepped into her trap. The moment the first guy pushed through the entrance, his boot caught on the fishing wire stretched across the floor, the nearly invisible thread snapping tight around his ankle. He barely had time to process what had happened before his body was yanked forward, thrown off balance, his momentum sending him crashing face first onto the floor. A loud thud echoed through the shop as he groaned, his hands scrambling beneath him in an attempt to push himself up. But before he could regain his footing, the metal shelf near the entrance tipped over, sending a rain of hot combs, shampoo bottles, and styling tools crashing onto his back. Crap! Another one of the men started to step inside, reaching for a weapon. But the moment his boots hit the tile, he lost his balance. His arms flailed wildly as his feet slipped on the thin layer of baby oil Amira had spread across the floor, his body completely failing him as he tumbled backward, hitting the ground with a sickening thud. The moment he went down, Amira moved. With explosive force, she swung the bat low, aiming directly for his ribs. The wood connected with a sharp, hollow crack, the sound of bone and impact filling the air as he let out a strangled gasp, his entire body convulsing as he clutched his side in agony. J-Rock's smirk was gone. Everything had happened too fast. They had come in thinking this was an easy job, expecting her to be terrified, to beg, to surrender before they even had to lay a hand on her. But Amira wasn't begging. She was fighting back. J-Rock's face darkened, his hand twitching at his side before he pulled a switchblade from his pocket, flicking it open with a sharp metallic click. "You think you a damn superhero, huh?" he snarled, his voice filled with uncontained rage. "Think you some kind of warrior?" Amira rolled her shoulders, her grip tightening around the bat, her eyes steady as she met his glare without fear. "I ain't gotta think," she said calmly. "I am." J-Rock lunged, the sharp gleam of his switchblade slicing through the dim light of royal roots, the edge aiming straight for Amira's midsection. He moved fast, but not fast enough. Amira twisted her body at the last second, stepping sideways, letting the blade miss her by inches. Before J-Rock could recover, she grabbed his wrist with both hands, twisting hard, using the momentum of his own attack against him. The knife clattered to the floor, bouncing once before skidding under a station chair. J-Rock barely had time to react before Amira's elbow drove into his ribs, forcing a choked gasp from his throat. He stumbled back, his hand instinctively going to his side, his face twisting in rage and disbelief. He hadn't expected this. None of them had. For a split second, the entire shop froze, the air thick with stunned silence as J-Rock's men took in what had just happened. Then, chaos erupted. Dre and Reese rushed forward at the same time, their eyes burning with aggression. The one with the crowbar lifted it high, his muscles tightening for a downward swing, aimed right at Amira's head. She moved first. Her hands shot out, grabbing a salon chair by the backrest, and with a powerful heave, she swung it upward, catching the crowbar mid-air. The impact sent a violent jolt through Dre's arm, the force knocking him off balance. His grip loosened just enough for Amira to slam the chair into his chest, sending him staggering backward, crashing into a mirror with a loud, splintering shatter. The second man, Reese, charged right on Dre's heels, trying to take advantage of the distraction. His hands were balled into fists, his steps quick and heavy. But Amira had already anticipated it. She dropped low, shifting her weight onto her back foot, then thrust forward with a brutal jab, her fist colliding with the soft flesh of his throat. Reese choked, eyes bulging as he stumbled sideways, gasping for air, one hand clutching at his neck while the other flailed for balance. A third attacker tried to grab her from behind, but Amira had been in too many fights to let someone sneak up on her that easily. As soon as she felt the movement behind her, she whipped her head back, slamming the back of her skull into his face. There was a sickening crack, the unmistakable sound of a nose breaking, followed by a sharp yelp of pain as he reeled away, blood streaming down his mouth. Another man grabbed a hairdryer off the counter, swinging it like a makeshift club, aiming right for her head. Amira ducked, narrowly avoiding the strike, then drove her knee into his stomach before he could recover. He let out a pained grunt, his body folding inward, and she followed up with a savage hammer fist to the side of his jaw. His legs gave out beneath him, and he crumpled to the floor, unmoving. J-Rock, now recovered from her earlier hit, wiped his bloody nose on the sleeve of his jacket. His teeth clenched. "Get her, you dumbasses!" Two more rushed in, one grabbing a pair of scissors from the styling station, the other swinging wildly with a set of brass knuckles. Amira's body moved on instinct, years of training flooding back like muscle memory. She sidestepped the man with the brass knuckles, letting his momentum carry him forward, then grabbed his arm and whipped him around, using his own weight to send him crashing into his friend. The man with the scissors stumbled, nearly losing his grip, and in that split second, Amira struck. She brought her elbow down hard on his wrist, forcing the blade to clatter to the ground before planting a brutal kick into his knee, sending him sprawling onto his back with a pained cry. The fight wasn't just brutal. It was tactical. Amira wasn't just hitting hard. She was hitting smart. She knew how to use their size and weight against them, redirecting their force rather than trying to overpower them outright. She used the environment to her advantage, making every step, every movement, calculated and efficient. But she wasn't invincible. A heavy fist suddenly slammed into her side, knocking the breath from her lungs, pain exploding in her ribs. She gritted her teeth, absorbing the blow, but the impact had left her open. Another man, one she hadn't noticed creeping up behind her, grabbed her by the arm, yanking hard, trying to pull her off balance. For the first time, Amira's footing wavered, and that's when she saw him. Lil Trey, the youngest of J-Rock's crew, barely more than a kid, stood frozen near the entrance, his back pressed against the doorframe. His eyes were wide, darting between the carnage unfolding before him. His hands twitched at his sides like he wanted to move, but he didn't. Amira locked eyes with him. There was hesitation there, uncertainty, fear, doubt. For the first time, she saw it. He didn't want to be here. The moment lasted only a second, but in a fight like this, a second was all she needed. She twisted violently, breaking free from the man's grip on her arm, then spun on her heel, bringing her elbow up in a sharp arc, connecting squarely with his temple. He dropped instantly, his body crashing onto a pile of fallen styling products. The room was in shambles now. Mirrors cracked, chairs overturned, hair products spilled across the floor like blood in the aftermath of battle. J-Rock was still standing, barely, his chest heaving, one hand clutching his ribs. His men were either unconscious, groaning, or staggering toward the exit. Lil Trey still hadn't moved. Amira took a step toward him, voice steady, despite the bruises forming beneath her skin. "You don't gotta go down with them, kid." Trey's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard, his gaze darting to J-Rock, then back to Amira. J-Rock let out a pained, bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Trey, if you don't get your ass in here," but the kid didn't move. Instead, he did the only thing that made sense in that moment. He ran. J-Rock's face twisted with rage as he watched him go, but he was too injured to chase after him. His focus snapped back to Amira, his glare dark and venomous. "This ain't over," he spat, his voice dripping with fury. Amira wiped a smear of blood from the corner of her mouth with the back of her hand. "No," she said, her voice firm, unshaken. "It ain't." Amira knew better than to believe the fight was over. J-Rock had taken his beating, his boys had limped out of Royal Roots, and for now they were licking their wounds. But men like J-Rock never let humiliation sit for long. He would come back harder, meaner, with a plan that went beyond bricks through windows and broken furniture. And the worst part? He wasn't the only problem. Amira had seen it in Detective Burns's face during his last visit. The way he spoke with just a little too much familiarity about how these things go. How he had told her to play it smart, like he was offering her some kind of lifeline. The moment he stepped into her shop after the first attack, she had felt it in her gut. He wasn't here to help her. He was here to keep things quiet, to make sure the pieces fell in the right place. She just didn't know whose side he was really on, yet. So Amira did what she had always been good at. She watched. She waited. And when the time was right, she followed. It had been 3 days since the attack on Royal Roots, and Amira had kept a low profile, running her shop as usual, making repairs where she could, and keeping an eye on her surroundings. J-Rock's boys had stopped hanging around outside, not because they were afraid, but because they were planning something bigger. Amira didn't believe in coincidences, and the fact that Burns hadn't been back to check in only made her more suspicious. So when she spotted his unmarked car parked outside a rundown bar on the south side of town late that night, she didn't hesitate. She followed on foot, staying back, keeping to the shadows. Burns wasn't in uniform, which meant this wasn't official police business. That meant he was up to something. The bar he had entered was a place she had seen before. The Pit, a hole-in-the-wall joint known for backroom deals and criminals who weren't afraid to get their hands dirty. Burns didn't belong here. Unless he did. Amira slipped inside, keeping her hood up, her steps careful and measured. The air smelled like cheap beer, sweat, and bad decisions. Dim lights flickered overhead, illuminating the cracked bar stools and a jukebox that hadn't worked in years. A few men sat hunched over their drinks, barely looking up when she passed. She spotted Burns near the back, tucked into a booth with J-Rock sitting across from him. Her stomach tightened. There it is. J-Rock's face was still bruised from their last encounter, a faint purple mark near his jaw. But he wasn't acting like a man who had been beaten down. He was leaning forward, talking low, confident. Burns, on the other hand, looked tired, rubbing his face as he listened, nodding occasionally. Amira moved closer, finding a darkened corner near the bar where she could eavesdrop without drawing attention. J-Rock's voice carried, just enough for her to catch bits and pieces. Told you it was handled. Burns let out a harsh breath. Handled? You call what happened at that shop handled? You're lucky nobody got killed. J-Rock chuckled, the sound low and amused. Ain't my fault my guys got sloppy. What? You expect me to just let her slide? Burns leaned in, his voice tight. I expect you to keep things quiet. You keep pushing, people start asking questions, and that's bad for both of us. Amira clenched her jaw. So that was it. Burns wasn't just letting J-Rock operate, he was protecting him. J-Rock smirked, swirling the drink in his glass. Man, relax. Nobody gonna find out you've been keeping the heat off me. You do your job, I do mine, and we both eat. That was the deal, wasn't it? Burns didn't answer right away. He exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face, before muttering, Yeah, that was the deal. Amira felt the weight of those words settle into her bones. Burns wasn't just on J-Rock's payroll. He was making sure J-Rock stayed in power. She had suspected corruption in the department. Hell, everyone in the neighborhood did, but now she had proof. And proof was dangerous, because it meant she wasn't just up against J-Rock anymore. She was up against the system protecting him. Amira didn't stick around to hear the rest. She had heard enough. Moving as silently as she came, she slipped out of the pit and back into the night, her mind already racing. This wasn't just about Royal Roots anymore. If J-Rock had cops keeping his pockets lined, then no amount of police reports, no amount of waiting on justice was going to save her shop. She needed to expose this. She needed to make it undeniable. Because if Burns was the reason J-Rock had never been taken down before, then she was going to be the reason he went down now. But she had to be careful. If she made one wrong move, she wouldn't just have J-Rock coming after her. She'd have the entire dirty half of the department doing the same. She took a slow, deep breath, letting the cool night air ground her. Then she did what she did best. She started planning. Amira didn't go home that night. After what she had seen at the pit, she knew there was no turning back. J-Rock wasn't just some gang leader shaking down local businesses. He was protected, shielded by a system that was just as corrupt as he was. And Burns, the so-called law in this city, wasn't just looking the other way. He was making sure J-Rock stayed in power. She sat alone in Royal Roots, the dim light from the street lamp outside flickering through the boarded-up windows, her fingers tracing the edges of her phone as she replayed the recording in her mind. Every word, every smug admission, every piece of evidence that Burns and J-Rock had given her without even realizing it. She had everything she needed. Now, all she had to do was use it. The first call she made was to Marcus. She didn't bother easing into it. There wasn't time. As soon as he picked up, she simply said, I need you at the shop. Now. There was no hesitation. On my way. 15 minutes later, Marcus walked into Royal Roots, shutting the door behind him with a quiet click. His presence filled the room. Solid. Steady. The kind of man you wanted at your back when things got ugly. He took one look at Amira and knew. You got something, he said, his voice calm but expectant. She slid her phone across the counter, pressing play on the recording. Burns's voice filled the room, his own words digging his grave. Look, just keep it quiet, and I'll make sure patrols stay off your block. You know how this works. Just pay your dues, and I'll keep things smooth. Marcus listened without speaking, his face unreadable as the recording played out, as J. Rock's laughter mixed with Burns's tired acceptance of their arrangement. When it ended, he exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "You got 'em. I got a piece of them," Amira corrected, her jaw tightening. "But I need all of them in one place. One hit. No escapes." Marcus leaned back against the counter, rubbing a hand over his beard as he considered it. "And what's the bait?" She met his eyes without hesitation. "Me." The plan had to be perfect. It had to look real. It had to look like Amira was desperate. She made sure the right people overheard her doubts, let it slip that she was finally ready to be smart about the situation, that she had seen the bigger picture and was willing to play along. She let it be known that she wanted to make things right before J-Rock escalated further. J-Rock took the bait with zero hesitation. His ego wouldn't let him believe otherwise. Burns set up the meeting, picking the location himself, an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. Neutral ground, a place where Amira wouldn't have any backup, any control. He thought he was being careful, thought he was setting the terms. What he didn't know was that Amira had chosen the location herself. By the time night fell, Marcus had already been inside the warehouse for hours, setting everything up. He wasn't just an ex-Marine. He was a tactician, a fighter, a man who knew how to turn any environment into an advantage. By the time the meeting was set, the warehouse was ready. J-Rock and Burns thought they were walking into a negotiation, but in reality, they were walking into a battlefield. Amira stood alone in the center of the warehouse, arms crossed, her stance casual but deliberate. She could hear the low rumble of an approaching engine, the slow roll of cars pulling up outside, the sharp slam of doors as men stepped out onto the cracked pavement. J-Rock entered first, his usual swagger intact, though his face still carried the bruises from their last encounter. He had 4 men with him, their movements confident, lazy, like they had already won. They weren't just carrying weapons. They were relaxed about it, their hands resting near holsters, near blades tucked into belts. Burns followed close behind, dressed in plain clothes. No badge, no sign that he was anything but a criminal in uniform. His eyes swept the space, scanning for anything out of place, but he didn't see what wasn't obvious. Everything looked empty. Everything looked exactly how they expected. Amira didn't move, didn't react. She just watched as J-Rock sauntered forward, shaking his head with an almost amused look on his face. "Now that's more like it," he said, gesturing around the room like he owned it. "See? This is how things should have been from the start. You being smart, finally realizing how crap works around here." Amira tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "That's so," J-Rock smirked. "You knew you didn't have a choice. You can fight all you want, but in the end, you fall in line." Burns stepped forward, his hands tucked in his jacket pockets. "You made the right call, Williams." His voice was quieter than J-Rock's, more measured, but it carried the same certainty, the same arrogance. "This is bigger than your shop. You had to know that." Amira let the silence hang between them for a moment, letting them settle into their victory. Then she exhaled slowly, tilting her chin slightly. "So, what happens now?" J-Rock grinned. "Now, you sign over a piece of your profits, make things easy, and in return, we make sure nothing happens to you. We keep everything peaceful." Amira smiled, but there was no warmth in it. She could feel it. The shift, the moment before the storm breaks. Because J-Rock and Burns still thought they were in control. They still thought they were leading this conversation. What they didn't know was that Marcus was in the rafters, waiting for the signal. What they didn't know was that every exit had been cut off. What they didn't know was that the fight hadn't ended at Royal Roots. It was just beginning. Amira shifted her weight slightly, her stance relaxing just enough to make J-Rock smirk. He thought he had won. Good. Let him think that, for just a few more seconds. Because the next time he blinked, he'd realize he had just walked into his own damn grave. The warehouse was silent, the kind of silence that comes before a storm, heavy with unspoken threats, and the quiet arrogance of men who thought They had already won. J-Rock stood in front of Amira, his smirk widening as she remained still, drinking in what he believed was her surrender. Burns, standing slightly behind him, wasn't smiling. His posture was stiff, his hands deep in his jacket pockets, his eyes flickering over the space like a man who was starting to sense something wasn't quite right. Amira let them enjoy their illusion of victory for a moment longer before reaching into her pocket. She didn't move fast, didn't give them reason to react. She simply pulled out her phone, tapped the screen once, and let the sound fill the warehouse. Burns's own voice echoed off the metal walls. "Look, just keep it quiet, and I'll make sure patrols stay off your block. You know how this works." J-Rock's smirk faltered, but only slightly. His gaze slid toward Burns, amused, but not yet concerned. "Damn," he chuckled, shaking his head. "That's crazy, cop. She got you real good." Amira didn't stop the recording. "Just pay your dues and I'll keep things smooth. Ain't nobody gonna find out you've been keeping the heat off me. You do your job, I do mine, and we both eat. That was the deal, wasn't it?" Burns stiffened. His face lost color, his mouth parting slightly as if scrambling for an excuse. He turned sharply toward J-Rock, his voice a hushed, angry whisper. "You said you had this handled." J-Rock, who had been amused a moment ago, now had a muscle ticking in his jaw. His hands curled into fists at his sides, and when he spoke, his voice was darker, more measured. "And you said the cops wouldn't be a problem." For the first time since they stepped inside, they weren't looking at Amira as their common enemy. They were looking at each other. That was all she needed. "You two done?" she asked, her tone calm, almost lazy. "Or you want to argue some more before I take you both apart?" J-Rock's head snapped toward her, his arrogance returning as if he had momentarily forgotten who was standing in front of him. His lips curled into something between amusement and irritation. "See, now I know you lost your damn mind." His fingers flexed at his sides, rolling his neck like a fighter about to step into a ring. "You really think you're walking out of here?" Amira exhaled through her nose, rolling her own shoulders, loosening up. "I don't think," she murmured. "I know." The moment hung between them, a single breath of stillness before the tension snapped. J-Rock moved first. He lunged, swinging with a wild, confident hook, putting all of his weight into it, aiming to drop her with one hit. Amira ducked smoothly, letting his fist sail just inches above her head. She was already moving before he could recover, stepping inside his reach, planting her foot, and driving her elbow deep into his ribcage. The impact was sharp, enough to make him grunt and stumble slightly, but he was too big to drop from just one hit. He twisted, throwing a knee toward her stomach, but Amira caught it with both hands, twisted sharply, and sent him sprawling onto the concrete floor. J-Rock's boys reacted instantly. Dre was the first to rush in, a heavy-set man with fast hands. He came in swinging, his fists aiming for her face, but Amira leaned back, weaving through the strikes with controlled precision. The moment he overextended, she caught his wrist, yanked him forward, and drove her knee into his stomach. He choked, doubling over. She grabbed the back of his neck and drove him headfirst into the nearest crate. Burns, who had been frozen up until now, seemed to realize the shift in control. He lunged from behind, trying to grab Amira in a chokehold, but she had felt him coming. She twisted at the last second, grabbing his arm, using his own momentum to flip him over her shoulder and onto the cold concrete with a heavy slam. Burns groaned, struggling to get up, but before he could, Marcus emerged from the shadows. His boot came down hard on Burns's chest, pinning him in place. "Nah," Marcus said, his voice low. "You sit this one out." Meanwhile, J-Rock had pushed himself back to his feet, shaking off the hit. His eyes burned with humiliation and rage. "All right," he muttered, rolling his shoulders. "You want to do this the hard way?" He charged again, this time more controlled, more focused. He threw a sharp feint with his right, but his real attack came from his left. A tight, powerful uppercut meant to break through her defense. Amira saw it coming. She sidestepped at the last second, avoiding the blow entirely, and before he could reset, she slammed her fist into his throat. J-Rock choked, his breath hitching as he stumbled back, gasping, his hands instinctively going to his neck. Amira didn't stop. She closed the distance, delivering a sharp kick to the back of his knee, forcing him down. The second he hit the ground, she grabbed his head and yanked it backward, keeping him in place. He struggled, snarling through gritted teeth. "You done yet?" she asked, her breath steady, unshaken. J-Rock growled low in his throat, still trying to push up despite the undeniable weight of his defeat pressing down on him. She squeezed harder, her grip firm against his jaw. "You don't run this street anymore," she said, voice calm and final. "You don't run me. This is over." But she knew J-Rock. She knew his type. And she knew he wasn't going down without one final play. She saw his muscles tense before he moved, felt his weight shift, and knew he was about to try and break free. Amira's hold tightened. J-Rock ripped himself free from Amira's grip, his brute strength overpowering her hold as he twisted violently, using the weight of his body to throw her off balance. The moment he broke loose, he drove his elbow backward with force, catching her hard in the side of the face. The impact sent a sharp sting through her jaw, snapping her head to the side. She barely had time to recover before he was on her again, his massive frame barreling forward, his fists swinging with pure aggression. Amira ducked under the first wild hook, feeling the wind of it rush past her ear. But J-Rock was faster than she had anticipated. He adjusted mid-motion, bringing his knee up and driving it into her midsection. The blow sent a shock wave through her ribs, knocking the breath from her lungs. She staggered, but she didn't go down. Instead, she twisted out of his reach, regaining her footing just as Dre charged in from the side. The heavy-set enforcer swung a fist toward her ribs, looking to wear her down with body shots. Amira turned just in time, deflecting the punch with her forearm, but the force of it still sent a dull ache radiating through her muscles. Before Dre could pull back, she struck fast, grabbing his wrist and twisting it sharply, forcing him to bend forward. With a quick step, she drove her elbow down onto his shoulder joint, making him grunt in pain as his body lurched involuntarily. But J-Rock wasn't waiting. He saw an opening and took it. Amira felt the impact before she saw it. J-Rock's fist crashed against the side of her head, rattling her skull. She barely managed to roll with the hit, but the force of it sent her stumbling sideways, her vision swimming for half a second. J-Rock didn't let up. He came in fast, grabbing the front of her hoodie and yanking her forward, his other hand already rising for another devastating punch. Amira reacted on instinct. She shifted her weight, used his grip against him, and twisted sharply, breaking free and pivoting into a brutal counterattack. She launched a palm strike straight into J-Rock's sternum, her full strength behind it. The blow forced him back a step, but not enough to drop him. Dre, shaking off the pain in his arm, roared as he lunged toward her again, looking to tackle her. Amira stepped to the side, redirecting his momentum, and as he stumbled past her, she brought her knee up viciously into his gut. The sound he made was wet, choked, as the air rushed out of his lungs. But before she could finish him off, J-Rock was back in the fight. He grabbed her from behind, his thick arms locking around her waist, lifting her clean off the ground. Amira's back slammed against the cold warehouse floor as he drove her down with full force, knocking the wind out of her. He was on top of her in an instant, one knee pressing into her abdomen, pinning her down as his fist came down toward her face. She moved just in time. J-Rock's punch barely missed, smashing into the concrete next to her head, the impact sending pain jolting up his knuckles. Using the moment, Amira twisted her body sharply, throwing him off balance. She shoved her forearm against his throat, bracing her legs, and flipped them over, reversing their positions. Now, she was on top. She drove her elbow down into his face, snapping his head back against the ground. He snarled, trying to shove her off, but Amira kept her balance, slamming another punch into his jaw. Before she could land a third, she felt hands yank at her shoulders. Reese, one of J-Rock's crew who had been waiting for his moment, grabbed her from behind, attempting to pull her off his boss. Amira reacted fast, grabbing Reese's wrist and twisting inward, using his own grip against him. She spun, breaking free, and delivered a savage kick to the inside of his knee, sending him collapsing sideways. But J-Rock had used the distraction to get back up. The moment she turned back toward him, he was already in motion, his fist crashing into her cheekbone. The impact sent a flash of white pain across her vision, her knees nearly buckling, but she caught herself before she went down. J-Rock grinned through bloodied teeth. "Tired yet?" Amira wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, tasting copper, feeling the swelling already forming beneath her skin. She exhaled through her nose, rolling her shoulders, steadying herself. Not even close. J-Rock let out a short laugh, then came at her again. This time, it was a full-on brawl. Blow after blow, Amira and J-Rock exchanged brutal strikes, neither of them holding back. He was bigger, stronger, but Amira was faster, sharper, more precise. She wove through his attacks, absorbing the ones she couldn't avoid, making him work for every inch. He threw a wild hook. She ducked under it and landed a sharp body shot into his side. He retaliated with a knee. She barely managed to block it before launching a spinning back fist that sent him reeling. J-Rock was getting frustrated. She could see it in the way his movements were losing discipline, the way his punches were getting wider, sloppier. But she wasn't the only one hurting. Her ribs ached, her muscles screamed, and her breathing was getting heavier. They circled each other now, both battered, both bleeding, both refusing to go down first. Behind her, Marcus was locked in his own fight, keeping the remaining goons at bay, making sure no one interfered. But this was between her and J-Rock now. No more words, no more threats, just the fight. The J-Rock rushed forward, throwing a brutal flurry of punches, trying to overwhelm her. Amira parried the first two, blocked the third, but the fourth slipped through, crashing into her ribs and knocking her back. She hit the ground, pain exploding through her body. J-Rock stood over her, breathing hard, his face dripping sweat and blood. He cracked his knuckles, rolling his shoulders. "Stay down," he warned, "before I put you down." Amira gritted her teeth, braced her hands against the floor, and slowly pushed herself up. J-Rock's face twisted in disbelief, watching her stand again. Amira locked eyes with him. "You first." J-Rock let out a snarl, then launched himself at her one more time. J-Rock charged like a bull, his body moving with sheer force, his fists clenched tight, rage pouring off him like heat from an open flame. Amira braced herself, watching his footwork, the way his muscles coiled before each movement. He was going for power over precision, trying to end this fight the only way he knew how, by crushing whatever was in front of him. She didn't let him. The second he swung, she pivoted, slipping just past the punch, feeling the rush of air as his fist barely missed her jaw. He was already winding up for another strike, a brutal downward swing meant to break something. Amira moved first. She stepped in, twisted her hips, and drove her fist into his exposed ribs. A quick, precise shot that sent a dull crack vibrating through her knuckles. J-Rock grunted, barely reacting before he swung again, this time catching her across the shoulder. The blow was heavy, knocking her back a step, but she stayed on her feet. The pain registered, sharp and deep, but she ignored it. She had to. J-Rock lunged, aiming to grab her. Amira ducked under his arms, grabbing his wrist mid-motion. Using his own momentum, she twisted hard, sending him stumbling past her. Before he could recover, she drove her knee into the back of his leg, forcing him to buckle. But he didn't go down. Instead, he twisted, shoving her hard enough that she slammed into a crate, pain exploding up her spine. He was on her again in a second, closing the space, throwing a wild hook toward her head. Amira barely blocked in time, absorbing most of the impact against her forearm. But J-Rock was relentless, throwing another punch, then another, his brute force bearing down on her like a tidal wave. A hit slipped through, smashing against her ribs. She felt the pain deep, something inside her threatening to give. J-Rock saw it. He grinned, the blood on his teeth making it almost feral. "Starting to break, huh?" he taunted, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. Amira exhaled slowly, rolling her shoulders, her heartbeat steady despite the ache. She lifted her chin slightly, eyes locked onto his. "You talk too much." J-Rock's grin flickered for half a second before he rushed her again. This time, Amira met him head-on. She stepped into his space, cutting off his swing before it could gain power. She grabbed his arm, twisting sharply before ramming her elbow into his jaw. His head snapped to the side, but he didn't fall. Instead, he drove his head forward, slamming it against her forehead in a savage headbutt. Stars burst across her vision, her balance teetering for a split second. A split second too long. J-Rock used the opening, grabbing her by the throat, lifting her slightly before slamming her back down onto the concrete. The impact rattled through her bones, knocking the wind from her lungs. For a moment, the world narrowed to just pain. J-Rock knelt over her, his weight pinning her down, his breath heavy against her face. "This what you wanted, huh? This little hero crap? Think you can beat me?" His fingers tightened around her throat, his strength pressing down. Amira didn't panic. Even as her airflow cut short, even as the pressure against her windpipe grew, she stayed focused. J-Rock was strong, but sloppy. He relied on overwhelming force, but force could be redirected. She gritted her teeth, planting her feet against his hips, and with every ounce of strength she had left, she kicked. The sudden force sent him flying backward, his grip breaking as he tumbled across the floor, landing with a heavy thud. Amira rolled onto her knees, coughing, her throat aching, but she didn't stay down. She pushed up, dragging in a full breath as she stalked forward, her steps slow but certain. J-Rock was getting up too, shaking off the fall, his expression shifting from amusement to something darker, something desperate. She could see it now, the doubt creeping in. The realization that she wasn't breaking, that she wasn't folding, that he had underestimated her. That was his mistake. And she was about to make sure he felt it. J-Rock threw another punch, sloppy, his movements slower than before. Amira caught his wrist mid-motion and yanked him forward, slamming her knee into his stomach. His body folded slightly, but she wasn't done. She grabbed the back of his head, twisting, and slammed him face first into the side of a metal crate. The impact was brutal. J-Rock stumbled, blood dripping from his nose, but he refused to fall. Amira didn't wait. She spun low, sweeping his legs out from under him, sending him crashing onto his back. The moment he hit the ground, she was already moving. She dropped onto him, pinning him beneath her, and with one final punch, she drove her fist into his face. J-Rock's head bounced against the concrete, his body going still for just a second. Not unconscious, not yet, but close. She grabbed him by the front of his hoodie, yanking him up just enough to make sure he saw her clearly. "You done?" she asked, voice steady despite the fire burning in her muscles. J-Rock's swollen eyes flickered, blood trickling from his split lip. He coughed, laughing weakly through the pain. "You hit like a truck, big girl." Amira exhaled slowly, her grip tightening. "And I can keep hitting all night." For a moment, he didn't move, then his lips curled, his bloody teeth flashing in something between a smirk and a grimace. "I don't quit," he rasped. Amira's jaw tightened. "Good," she murmured. Then she let him go. J-Rock barely had time to react before she stepped back, motioning with her fingers. "Get up." J-Rock, bruised and battered, let out a slow exhale, rolling his shoulders. He was moving slower now, his stance less sure, but he still stood, both of them bleeding, both barely holding themselves together. One last round. No distractions. No holds barred. Amira raised her fists. Let's finish this. J-Rock stood across from Amira, his chest heaving, his breath ragged, sweat dripping down his bloodied face. His lip was split, his right eye swollen, his ribs bruised from the unrelenting punishment Amira had dealt him. Yet, he was still standing. Amira was no better. Every muscle in her body screamed. Her ribs ached from the blows she had taken, and her arms felt like lead. Her knuckles throbbed, raw and bruised from hitting J-Rock over and over again. But she wasn't done yet, and neither was he. The warehouse felt smaller now, the space between them charged with nothing but raw determination. The sounds of J-Rock's men groaning in pain faded into the background. This was it. No weapons, no backup, no more words. Just the fight. J-Rock wiped the blood from his mouth with the back of his hand, rolling his shoulders like he was gearing up for one final push. He smirked through the pain, his teeth red-stained. "You still think you got me beat?" he rasped, voice rough. Amira tilted her head slightly, her lips twitching into something that wasn't quite a smile. "I don't think," she murmured. "I know." J-Rock let out a short, harsh chuckle. Then he moved. He lunged, fast despite his injuries, throwing a tight jab toward her face. Amira barely dodged, feeling the air shift as his knuckles grazed past her cheek. But she had read him now. He wasn't as fast as before. His punches were still powerful, but he was slowing down, his muscles exhausted, his body struggling to keep up. She capitalized on it. She stepped inside his reach, cutting off his follow-up, and slammed a short, sharp uppercut into his ribs. J-Rock grunted but twisted, trying to counter. Amira anticipated it, weaving under his hook and delivering a brutal knee to his stomach. His breath hitched as the impact folded him slightly, but he forced himself upright, swinging an elbow toward her temple. It connected, barely, but enough to make Amira's vision blur for a second. J-Rock saw his opening and tackled her, driving her backward. They hit the floor hard, J-Rock pinning her beneath him, his hands wrapping around her throat. His grip was tight, his weight pressing down, crushing the air from her lungs. Amira gritted her teeth, refusing to panic. She twisted fast, breaking his grip, her fingers clawing into his wrist. She yanked him forward just enough to throw him off balance, then slammed the heel of her palm into his chin, snapping his head back. J-Rock staggered, his grip loosening. That was all she needed. She planted her feet, threw her weight upward, and sent him tumbling off of her. The second she was free, she rolled and kicked him in the side, forcing him to scramble back onto his feet. He wasn't grinning anymore. This wasn't fun for him. This was survival. He came at her again, slower this time, his body weighing him down. His punches weren't as crisp. His footwork wasn't as sharp. Amira, despite her exhaustion, still had control. She dodged, slipped around his attack, saw the gaps, the weaknesses. He was leaving openings now. She took advantage of every single one. She slammed a fist into his gut, a hook to his jaw, an elbow to his temple. Each strike chipped away at him, knocking him back, stealing his breath, taking him apart piece by piece. J-Rock threw one last desperate swing, sloppy, reckless. Amira caught his arm, twisted it violently, and sent him crashing onto the concrete. This time, he didn't get up right away. His breath was loud in the empty warehouse, labored and unsteady. His body shook with exhaustion, his arms trembling as he tried to push himself upright. Amira stood over him, her breathing rough but controlled. She grabbed the front of his hoodie, yanking him up just enough to make sure he saw her clearly. "You done?" she asked, her voice calm, steady, unshaken. J-Rock blinked up at her, his swollen eye barely opening, his lip bleeding freely. He coughed, shaking his head slightly. But the fight was gone from his posture. Finally, after a long pause, he exhaled through his nose. His head dipped slightly, his shoulders sagging. Amira could feel it, the shift, the moment he realized that he had lost. She let go of his hoodie, letting him drop back onto the cold floor. Around them, the rest of his men were either out cold or groaning in pain. Marcus still standing guard, his own knuckles bruised from the beating he had delivered. J-Rock swallowed hard, his head rolling to the side as he stared up at the ceiling. He let out a short, weak laugh, shaking his head. "Crap," he muttered. Amira exhaled slowly, rolling her shoulders. "That's what happens when you pick the wrong one." J-Rock didn't argue. He just lay there, battered, beaten, broken. The fight was over, but Amira wasn't done yet. She wasn't just going to walk away from this. She was going to make sure that J-Rock never had the power to do this to anyone again. And that meant one last step. The police were coming, and this time, they weren't on his side. J-Rock lay on the cold concrete, his chest rising and falling in ragged breaths, his body too battered and broken to push himself up again. The arrogance, the confidence, the smug, untouchable smirk that had been on his face when he walked into the warehouse, all of it was gone. His swollen eye barely opened, his lips split, his fingers twitching like he was still trying to summon the strength to keep fighting. But his body had given out on him. The realization of it settled over him like a heavy weight. The truth, undeniable. He had lost. Amira stood over him, her own body aching, her ribs bruised, her knuckles raw and throbbing. But she remained upright, her breath deep and controlled, despite the war her body had just endured. She flexed her fingers, rolling her shoulders, willing herself to stay sharp, because she knew this wasn't over yet. The fight was finished, but the battle, the real battle, was only now reaching its final stage. She took a slow step back, giving herself just a moment to glance around at the aftermath of the war she had waged inside this warehouse. J-Rock's men were either unconscious or barely conscious. Their bodies sprawled across the space, groaning, shifting, but none of them getting up. Marcus, standing near the edge of the chaos, wiped the blood from his knuckles on the front of his shirt, his eyes scanning the room, making sure no one had the strength left to try something stupid. Burns, still slumped against a stack of crates, let out a pained grunt as he slowly lifted his head, his expression no longer composed, no longer carrying the weight of authority he had walked in with. His shirt was stained with sweat and dust, his face twisted in something between pain and panic, as his mind scrambled to figure out his next move, but he had none. Amira turned her gaze back to J-Rock, watching as he finally, with a painful groan, rolled onto his side, his bloody teeth gritted together as he forced himself up onto his elbows, every movement slow and painful. He coughed, spitting blood onto the ground before tilting his head up toward her, his breath heavy, but his pride still clinging to him like a disease. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, with a weak, almost mocking chuckle, he exhaled through his nose. "You really think this means anything?" His voice was hoarse, raw from the fight. But the defiance was still there, buried under the exhaustion. "You think beating me in some run-down warehouse is going to change a damn thing?" He licked the blood from his lip, his head tilting slightly as his eyes locked onto hers, dark and knowing. "Ain't just me, big girl. There's always another me, another crew. You ain't changed, crap." Amira didn't blink. She let him get it out, let him cling to the last remnants of the power he thought he had, before she finally spoke. "You're right," she said, her voice even, calm, steady, despite the pain in her ribs. "There's always another you." She crouched down slightly, meeting his eye level, making sure he saw her clearly. "But there ain't never gonna be another me." J-Rock's smirk flickered. That was the moment he realized it. This wasn't about some gang war, some fight over territory or power. This was about her. And she wasn't someone he could just scare, couldn't just bully into submission, couldn't just make disappear. She was still standing, and he wasn't. The sound of sirens cut through the night air, the wail growing louder, closer, red and blue lights flashing through the high windows of the warehouse. illuminating the dust still hanging in the air from the fight. J-Rock stiffened slightly, his jaw tensing, the first real hint of fear creeping into his eyes. Burns cursed under his breath, his head snapping toward the entrance as the reality of his situation began to sink in. Marcus smirked slightly, shaking his head. Right on time. Amira stood up slowly, rolling her shoulders as she exhaled. Told you this was over. J-Rock let out another breathless, bitter chuckle, but this time it was quieter, almost hollow. His head dropped slightly, as if he finally accepted there was no way out of this. The doors to the warehouse slammed open, the heavy boots of real cops storming in, their weapons drawn, their voices loud, commanding. Hands in the air! Don't move! Amira lifted her hands easily, calm, unbothered. J-Rock, still on the ground, let out a slow sigh before he did the same. Burns, however, hesitated. One of the officers turned toward him, recognition flickering across his face as his brows furrowed. Burns? The detective swallowed hard, his fingers twitching like he was about to make a very bad decision. Amira arched a brow. Go ahead, she said, watching him carefully. Run. See how far you get. Burns's eyes snapped toward her, wild now, but he could see it. The way the officers were already assessing him differently, how the realization was starting to dawn in their faces as they put the pieces together. Then one of them spoke into his radio. Confirmed. We got the audio recordings. Looks like we got ourselves a dirty cop. Burns's shoulders sagged. His head dropped forward, his fingers curling into fists before he finally lifted his hands in surrender. J-Rock just let out another tired chuckle, shaking his head as an officer grabbed him roughly, yanking him forward to slap cuffs around his wrists. Guess you ain't as untouchable as you thought, Amira muttered, watching as both J-Rock and Burns were pulled toward the waiting squad cars outside. For the first time in a long time, she felt it. The weight lifting. She glanced at Marcus, who stretched his arms, rotating his sore shoulders. He looked at her with a smirk. Well, that was fun. Amira let out a slow, exhaled breath, shaking her head. Fun isn't the word I'd use. Marcus chuckled, cracking his knuckles. Good thing I wasn't asking. As the cops hauled J-Rock and Burns away, the flashing lights illuminating the broken warehouse, Amira took one last look at the space where the fight had ended. She had won, but more than that, she had ended this. For good. And as she and Marcus stepped out into the night, leaving the wreckage behind, she knew one thing for certain. Royal Roots was still standing, and so was she. J-Rock lay sprawled on the cold concrete, his chest heaving, his face battered beyond recognition, his once cocky demeanor stripped away, leaving behind only a broken, bloodied shell of the man who had terrorized her shop for weeks. His fingers twitched against the floor, his swollen eyes barely open, his breath coming in ragged bursts as he tried and failed to push himself back up. The weight of the moment settled over him, crushing, undeniable. He had lost. Amira stood over him, her own body aching, her knuckles split, her ribs screaming with every inhale, but she was still on her feet. Every muscle in her body burned, but she refused to show weakness, refused to let him see even an ounce of exhaustion. She had fought men like him before, bigger, stronger, meaner, and she had taken them down, just like she had done tonight. She rolled her shoulders back, shaking out her bruised hands as she scanned the wreckage around her. J-Rock's men lay scattered, moaning in pain, barely conscious, some of them curled up on the floor, too injured to even try and get back up. A few had crawled toward the exit, desperate to escape, but Marcus had made sure none of them left before it was over. Burns, still slumped against a stack of crates, let out a strangled groan, his hand clutching his side as he struggled to lift his head. The cocky detective was gone, replaced by a man who had realized, far too late, that he had backed the wrong horse. His face twisted in pain, his mind clearly racing for a way out. But there was none. The walls were closing in, and he knew it. Amira's attention shifted back to J-Rock, who let out a weak, wet chuckle, blood staining his teeth as he tilted his head up to look at her. His voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper. "You think this changes anything?" He coughed, spitting red onto the floor, his swollen lips curling into a bitter smirk. "Ain't just me, big girl. Another crew, another boss. They'll come. You ain't changed nothin'." Amira's expression remained unreadable. She crouched down beside him, her voice calm, level, steady as ever. "You're right," she murmured. "There's always another you, another low life with a little power, another thug thinking he owns the streets, another dirty cop making sure he stays on top." She tilted her head slightly, letting the words sink in. "But you know what there ain't?" J-Rock blinked slowly, his eyes clouded with exhaustion, with pain. "There ain't never gonna be another me." For the first time, his smirk faded. That was the moment he understood. This wasn't just about money or power or control. This was about Amira, and he couldn't break her, no matter how hard he tried. The distant wail of sirens pierced the silence, the flashing red and blue lights painting streaks across the warehouse walls. The sound grew louder, closer, until the front doors burst open, and uniformed officers stormed inside, their voices cutting through the air like gunfire. "Hands where we can see them!" J-Rock didn't move. Burns stiffened, his face draining of all color. He turned toward the entrance, his mind racing, his eyes darting between the cops flooding into the warehouse, his fellow officers, the ones not on his payroll. One of them, a hard-faced sergeant, stepped forward, his sharp gaze landing on Burns immediately. His voice was clipped, professional. "Detective Burns," he said, his tone unreadable. "You're under arrest for conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and aiding and abetting criminal activity." Burns's hands twitched like he was considering making a run for it, but Amira simply arched a brow, shaking her head slightly. "Go ahead," she said, her voice smooth. "See how far you get." Burns swallowed hard. He knew he had nowhere to go. Slowly, with a deep, shuddering breath, he lifted his hands in surrender. The sergeant gave a curt nod, and two officers immediately stepped forward, yanking Burns to his feet, pulling his arms behind his back before slapping the cuffs onto his wrists with no ceremony, no hesitation. J-Rock, still on the ground, let out a quiet, bitter laugh as he watched. "Damn," he muttered, shaking his head weakly. "Guess you ain't as untouchable as you thought, huh, cop?" Burns didn't respond. He couldn't. Amira just exhaled, her shoulders relaxing slightly as she watched the scene unfold. She had waited for this moment, not just for herself, but for everyone who had suffered under men like J-Rock, under dirty cops like Burns, under the weight of a system that had failed them time and time again. Tonight, she had fought for more than her shop. She had fought for her neighborhood. The officers rounded up J-Rock and his men, locking their wrists in cuffs, dragging them toward the waiting squad cars outside. The gang leader barely resisted, his body too beaten, too exhausted to fight anymore. But even as he was pulled up, even as his knees buckled beneath him, he still turned toward Amira one last time, that damn smirk flickering back onto his face, though weaker now, hollow. "This ain't over," he murmured. "Somebody always fills the vacuum." Amira met his stare, steady, unwavering. "Then, I'll be here when they do." J-Rock's smirk finally faltered. The cops hauled him outside, his voice disappearing into the chaos. Marcus, still standing beside Amira, cracked his knuckles before letting out a low whistle. "Damn, that was satisfying." Amira let out a breath, wiping the blood from her mouth. "You're telling me?" They stepped outside together, the night air cool against their bruised skin, the neon sign of Royal Roots still glowing in the distance, still standing. Amira looked at it, then at the flashing lights, then at the wreckage of a war that had finally ended. She had won, and for the first time in a long time, she felt it. Peace, a victory that wasn't just for her, but for everyone who had ever been told to stay quiet, to take the abuse, to fold. They wouldn't fold anymore, and neither would she. The flashing red and blue lights bathed the street outside the warehouse in an eerie glow, reflecting off the broken glass, rusted metal, and the battered bodies of J-Rock and his men as they were dragged toward the waiting squad cars. The once untouchable gang leader, the man who had strutted into Royal Roots with arrogance dripping off him, now stumbled under the weight of his injuries, his wrists bound, his face swollen, his breath ragged. No one was laughing now. Not J-Rock. Not his crew. And certainly not Detective Burns, who stood off to the side, his hands cuffed behind his back, his expression a mix of humiliation, fear, and simmering resentment. The officers who had come to clean up this mess weren't his people, weren't the ones he could control, manipulate, or bribe. These were the real ones, the ones who had spent years watching the system fail, who had watched J-Rock and his gang terrorize this neighborhood without consequence, who had likely suspected for a long time that someone on the inside was keeping the streets dirty. And now they had proof. Amira stood off to the side, arms crossed, her body still aching from the fight, but her stance firm, her eyes sharp as she watched the officers work. One of them, a tall black sergeant with streaks of gray in his beard, walked toward her, his face unreadable. His uniform was crisp, his eyes weary but alert, like a man who had seen too much, but still gave a damn. "Williams," he greeted, his voice gruff but steady. Amira nodded once. "Sarge." The sergeant exhaled through his nose, looking around at the wreckage, the aftermath of the battle that had taken place in this warehouse. His gaze lingered on J-Rock, now slumped against the hood of a squad car, and then on Burns, who stood stiffly, staring straight ahead like a man trying not to let the weight of his fall sink in. "Been waiting for this one," the sergeant muttered, jerking his chin toward Burns. Amira arched a brow. "Yeah?" he nodded. "We knew we had rot in the department. But this is clean cut. We got him dead to rights." He glanced at her, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You did good." Amira let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. It was done. J-Rock's empire had collapsed in a single night. His men, the ones who weren't in cuffs, were either unconscious in the warehouse or dragging themselves away, broken and beaten, knowing that their time of running these streets was over. The few who might try to regroup wouldn't get the chance. With their leader gone and the police finally doing their damn job, the gang was done. The extortion, the threats, the violence, over. For the first time in a long time, Royal Roots and the rest of the neighborhood could breathe. Marcus, standing next to her, let out a low whistle as he watched J-Rock get shoved into the back of a squad car. "Damn. Feels good seeing that." Amira let her arms drop to her sides, rolling out her shoulders with a tired exhale. "About time." Marcus glanced at her, his brow furrowing slightly as he took in the bruises along her face, the dried blood at the corner of her mouth. "You good?" She smirked, despite the throbbing pain in her jaw. "I'll live." Marcus chuckled, shaking his head. "You're one scary-ass woman. You know that?" "Damn right," she muttered, cracking her neck. The sergeant turned toward them again, his expression unreadable. "You need a ride home?" Amira glanced at Royal Roots, standing just a few blocks away, its neon sign still glowing, flickering slightly, but still standing, just like her. "Nah," she said, shaking her head. "I'll walk." The sergeant didn't argue. He just nodded, watching as she turned and started down the street, her steps slow but steady. Marcus fell into step beside her, the two of them moving through the quiet streets, past darkened storefronts, past people peeking cautiously through their windows, past a neighborhood that had been living under J-Rock's rule for far too long. Tonight, that ended. Tonight, justice had been served. And tomorrow? Tomorrow, Amira would wake up, walk into her shop, and get back to work, like she always did. Because at the end of the day, Royal Roots wasn't just a business. It was a home, a safe haven, a piece of the community that no one, no gang, no dirty cop, no threat, could ever take from her again. She had fought for it, and she had won. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of rain from the night before, as Amira stood outside Royal Roots, looking up at the worn neon sign that had flickered through so many late nights, through so many battles. It still buzzed, still shone, still stood tall, just like her. The storefront bore the scars of war. The glass had been shattered, the wooden boards hastily nailed up from the last attack, the sign scratched from where bricks had once been hurled at it. But Royal Roots was still here, and today she was going to put it back together. Amira took a slow breath, stepping forward, pushing open the door, and stepping inside. The damage was worse in the daylight. Shattered mirrors, broken chairs, shelves knocked over, hair products spilled across the floor in colorful streaks. It looked chaotic, but Amira didn't see a mess. She saw a testament. This shop, her shop, had taken the worst J-Rock and his crew had to offer, and it was still standing, and so was she. Rolling up her sleeves, she grabbed a broom and got to work. The morning passed in steady, rhythmic motions, sweeping up the broken glass, picking up the overturned chairs, wiping down the counters. The act of cleaning wasn't just about fixing what had been broken, it was about reclaiming her space, about proving that this place, her place, belonged to no one but her. She worked in silence, save for the occasional grunt as she dragged heavy furniture back into place. Then the door creaked open. She didn't turn right away, still crouched down as she scooped up the remains of a broken comb from the floor. But she felt the presence standing in the doorway, hesitant, unsure. Finally, she looked up. Lil Trey. The kid stood there, shoulders hunched slightly, hands tucked into his hoodie pockets, his gaze darting around the shop, taking in the wreckage, the quiet aftermath of what had happened. Amira sat back on her heels, wiping the sweat from her brow with the back of her hand. "You lost?" Trey shook his head, but he still didn't step inside. He looked different today. Not as cocky, not as sure of himself. He looked like a kid who had just seen the truth about the life he thought he wanted. "I saw what happened," he muttered finally, kicking at the ground with the toe of his sneaker. "The warehouse." Amira nodded, standing up slowly, brushing dust off her jeans. "Yeah, you ran." Trey's jaw tightened. "I ain't no coward." Amira studied him for a moment, then nodded. "I know." She gestured toward the shop. "You here for a reason, or just sightseeing?" He hesitated again before stepping fully inside, his hands still shoved into his pockets, his shoulders drawn tight like he was bracing for something. "I'm done," he muttered, eyes flickering up to meet hers. "With them? With all of it?" Amira leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "That's so." Trey nodded quickly, swallowing hard. "J-Rock. He talked big, acted like he ran everything, like we was untouchable. But last night," he shook his head, his voice quieter now, "he ain't untouchable. None of them are." He looked at her fully then, his voice steady. "I don't want to end up like that." Amira watched him for a long moment. The kid had spent months following J-Rock's crew, running errands, laughing at the same threats they made, standing in the background while they bullied people like her. But last night had shaken something loose in him. He had seen how it ended, and he wanted out. She exhaled, tilting her head slightly. "So what now?" Trey shuffled his feet, his fingers fidgeting inside his hoodie pocket. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I ain't going back to that life. I don't know what to do next." Amira tapped her fingers against the counter thoughtfully. The kid had a lot to learn, and walking away from the streets wasn't as easy as just saying it. He was gonna need a plan, some guidance, and a reason to keep moving forward. She nodded toward the back of the shop. "You ever worked a real job before?" Trey blinked. "A job?" Amira repeated. "Something legal. Something that don't involve standing on corners acting tough for scraps." Trey hesitated before shaking his head. "Not really." Amira smirked. "Then it's about time you start." She stepped past him, grabbing an extra broom from behind the counter and tossing it toward him. He barely caught it, his hands fumbling around the handle. "First lesson," she said, crossing her arms again. "If you're gonna work here, you start from the ground up." Trey looked down at the broom, then back at her, his expression torn between confusion and something close to hope. "You serious?" he asked, Dead serious. Amira shrugged. Ain't gonna be easy. Ain't gonna be quick. But if you really want out, if you really want to do better, this is where you start. Trey's grip tightened on the broom. He looked around the shop again, at the damage, at the work still left to be done. Then, finally, he nodded. All right, he muttered, setting the broom against the floor. I'm in. Amira smirked, nodding approvingly. Then, get to sweeping! As Trey started working, a quiet energy settled over Royal Roots, a new beginning taking shape in the middle of all the destruction. Amira grabbed her own broom and got back to work beside him. Because this shop wasn't just a business, it was a symbol of resilience, of survival, of never backing down. And as the morning sun rose higher, spilling golden light through the half-boarded windows, she knew one thing for certain. Royal Roots had been through hell, and it had come out stronger, just like her. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends, and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.